Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Pierce, and I am the state senator for Hanover and most of the Upper Valley. Thank you very much for being here today for what I believe surely will be a very interesting and substantive discussion. Before we kick off the discussion, though, I wanted to take some time to explain why I'm so glad that Dartmouth, the Rockefeller Center, and the Tuck School invited Secretary Clinton to come and speak today as part of its America's Economic Future series. As Secretary Clinton has said so many times on the campaign trail, if she is elected president, she will fight and be the champion for policies that build an economy where normal middle-class families can get ahead and stay ahead. I support Secretary Clinton for president, and I have to say I really didn't need much convincing. I've had the pleasure of meeting Hillary several times over the years, and I've always been struck by her drive to fight for the issues that keep families like mine and others here in New Hampshire up at night. Secretary Clinton believes, as do I, that the system is rigged against the middle class and in favor of those at the top. And everyone, from hardworking families to students getting out of college with mountains of debt, need a president who will fight for them and not just those at the top. I believe that the next president also needs to build on the social progress that we've made in the last 7 years and not tear it down. As a gay man and a father of 2 daughters, I feel that imperative every day. I want my children to grow up free of discrimination, and when they learn what discrimination means, I don't want them to know that they could have been the object of it. I also want them to grow up in a world where debt doesn't hold them back from getting an education, where women and men are paid equally for the same work, and where common sense gun reforms and policies prevent the mentally ill and dangerous criminals from obtaining a gun, walking into a school or a movie theater and wreaking havoc. This is all part of Secretary Clinton's agenda for her presidency. And again, I thank the Tuck School and the Rockefeller Center for hosting this series and inviting Secretary Clinton and candidates from both parties to give their vision for an economic future that works for everyone and not just the privileged few. Thanks very much.
Please welcome Andrew Samwick, Director of the Rockefeller Center, and Matthew Slaughter, the Dean of the Tuck School.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andrew Samwick, and I'm a professor of economics and the director of the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center here at Dartmouth. On behalf of the whole Dartmouth community, welcome to the campus and to an event co-hosted by the Rockefeller Center and the Amos Tuck School of Business, focused on America's economic future. Our mission at the Rockefeller Center is to educate, train, and inspire the next generation of public policy leaders. We pursue this mission in part by hosting the leaders of today who have taken on the responsibilities of governing at the highest levels. There is no better way to inspire our students to civic engagement and public service. New Hampshire's first-in-the-nation primary is very important to us and to the candidates as they experience campaigning at a personal level. We thank Secretary Clinton and her staff for including Dartmouth, now multiple times, on her campaign for the presidency. I'd like to now turn over the microphone to Matthew Slaughter, Dean of the Tuck School of Business.
Thank you, Andrew. I would like to extend my and the Tuck School's thanks and welcome to everyone here, and thanks especially to all those who have put in countless hours of organization and planning for this event, such as Dartmouth's very own First Lady, Gail Gentis. At the Tuck School, our mission is to prepare wise leaders to become the difference in the world of business and beyond. Central to this mission is engaging our students and faculty with the dynamic interplay among global businesses, national governments, and civil society. Around the world, people today are yearning for business leaders who can do good in addition to doing well. This is certainly true in the United States, where a large majority of Americans are wondering how, in today's 21st century global economy, America will create the good jobs and a brighter tomorrow. To help answer this question, we at Tuck, through our Center for Global Business and Government, have been proud to invite to campus every major presidential candidate from both parties to have a forum for addressing America's economic future. We sincerely thank Secretary Clinton for being the third candidate to visit our campus to speak to these vital issues. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Governor John Lynch, Julia Lynch, and Hillary Clinton.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all very much for coming. This is the third in a series of presidential candidates coming to Dartmouth and Tuck to talk about America's economic future. Some of you may know I've been teaching at Tuck the last couple of years, and I have developed an enormous respect for the quality of education at Tuck and at Dartmouth College. I think Dartmouth and its affiliated graduate schools provide the finest education in America. So we should be very, very proud of that. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce my daughter, Julia, who will then introduce Secretary Clinton. You should know that Julia is the longest-serving second daughter in the history of the state of New Hampshire. Let's welcome Julia.
Good afternoon. As he said, I'm Julia Lynch. I'm a second-year Tuck student and would like to welcome you to the third part of the speaking series, America's Economic Future. Now, when I first started writing this introduction, I became overwhelmed with the amount of accomplishments Secretary Clinton has had throughout her life. As a current student who has spent a lot of time working on my own resume, I could only imagine the difficulties Secretary Clinton would have keeping her resume to the required one-page limit. Her impressive resume and list of accomplishments started well before she was involved in politics. She graduated from Wellesley College, where she was the first student commencement speaker, and then earned her JD from Yale Law School. Upon graduating from Yale, Secretary Clinton moved to Massachusetts to work for the Children's Defense Fund. After moving to Arkansas, where she practiced law, Secretary Clinton married President Bill Clinton, and soon after became First Lady of Arkansas. While she was First Lady, she fought for education standards and to expand healthcare access for the people of the state. In 1992, Secretary Clinton became the First Lady of the United States and persistently fought to reform the healthcare system and increase access to the families of the U.S. She created the Children's Health Insurance Program, which provides access to healthcare for more than 8 million children. In 2000, Secretary Clinton was the first woman to be elected U.S. Senator from the state of New York, where she spent her time helping to rebuild New York after the 9/11 tragedy. She also spent time working with both Democrats and Republicans to increase access of health care to the reserves, the National Guard, and their families. In 2008, Secretary Clinton was asked by President Obama to be his Secretary of State, where she continuously supported human rights, rights for opportunities for women and girls, the LGBT community, and young people around the world. During her tenure, Secretary Clinton visited 112 countries to help strengthen U.S. relations. That's 112 countries in 4 years. Talk about a full passport and more frequent flyer miles than a management consultant. After years of public service and giving back to others, Secretary Clinton is now in the presidential race for 2016. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you a First Lady, a Senator, a Secretary of State, a mother, and a grandmother, Hillary Clinton.
Thank you. Good job. Thanks, John. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, hello, Dartmouth, and particularly hello, Tuck. I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank Julia for that introduction. It looks to me like your dad's extremely proud of you. As a mom, I can kind of tell these things. And I also want to thank your mom, Dr. Susan Lynch. They have such an extraordinary record of public service themselves. People across New Hampshire still talk about what a terrific governor you were, Governor Lynch, and how much Dr. Lynch did on behalf of children's health. And I'm just so pleased to be here with both of you again. Thank you for this invitation. I also want to thank Senator David Pierce, who spoke earlier, who brought with him his two daughters, Emma and Grace, and everyone here at the university, Matthew Slaughter, the Dean of Tuck Business School, Andrew Samwick, Director of Rockefeller Center, and everyone else who is behind this very important series of presidential candidate visits. I love coming back to Dartmouth. I spent some time here when I was an undergraduate at Wellesley. Sometimes, yes, you get it. Sometimes, for student activity reasons, I did come up once for a blind date during Winter Carnival. Yeah. The date was just okay. But the carnival was excellent. Really was a great introduction about how to make winter fun. I'm here today to talk about America's economic future, and I know that's especially relevant to Tuck students because you're not just going to live in that future, you are going to help shape it. So I want to share some of what I think we need to do to point our country toward a strong and prosperous future. Then I'll turn it over to Governor Lynch and all of you. Let me start by saying that it was almost 7 years ago that President Obama took office amid the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. I hope it will be the worst economic crisis during your lifetimes. America was losing 800,000 jobs a month. Turned out 9 million Americans lost their jobs, 5 million lost their homes, and just listen to this. $13 trillion of family wealth was wiped away. That's years and years, even generations of hard work, saving, and sacrifice gone as people sold their houses, dipped into their savings, did whatever they could to keep going. So where are we today? Well, America's businesses have created more than 13 million jobs in the past 5.5 years. Unemployment was nearly 8% when President Obama took office. Now it's down to 5%. Manufacturing jobs are actually returning to America. People's 401ks are being restored. The auto industry is back on its feet. So for those of you graduating this spring, you are entering into an economy that is stronger and more resilient than it's been. Still, though, we have a long way to go. Most people's paychecks haven't budged in years, even though corporate profits are near record highs. America's top 25 hedge fund managers earn more than all of America's kindergarten teachers combined. The minimum wage is basically a poverty wage, and the costs of everything from prescription drugs to college tuition are rising faster than wages. And millions of people are burdened by student debt, a problem many of you already know about or will. And women are still paid less than men. Here in New Hampshire, actually, the gender wage gap is larger than the national average, even though women here work and graduate from college in greater numbers in New Hampshire than they do nationwide. So yes, a lot of families are on firmer footing than they were a few years ago, but many still worry about the progress they've made and whether it could all be ripped away again. And many of our neighbors are struggling to get by. And for me, nothing is more haunting than the number of American kids living in poverty today. We have a shameful statistic. 51% of our children in public schools today are eligible for free or reduced cost lunches. That's a poverty indicator that is just chilling in its implications. Now, all of these trends tell us we have serious work to do if we want to build an economy that truly does work for everyone and begins to lift people who are working out of poverty. Anyone asking for your vote for president should have a plan to keep our economy growing, but just plain growth isn't enough. Not if it's hollow growth, where all the benefits go to those at the top, or if it's built on speculation and bubbles that can burst in an instant. We need the kind of growth that reveals itself in bigger paychecks and more good jobs for American workers. That's why I've said getting incomes rising again with good-paying jobs is the defining economic challenge of our time. As I see it, that kind of growth has three attributes. It's stronger, it's fair, and it's long-term. Now, if it's strong but not fair, that is not good enough. And if our economy is built to grow in the short term but not the long term, that's not good enough either. Anyone asking for your vote should have a plan to do better than that. So I've spent the last several months laying out my plan. You can read all the details on my website, hillaryclinton.com, and I hope you will. But today I want to give you the highlights before we have a conversation. Strong growth to me means more good-paying jobs that pay good and rising wages. Now, over 60% of new jobs are created by small businesses, so we should do everything we can to make it easier to start and grow them. That means less red tape, easier access to credit, tax relief, and tax simplification. Businesses with fewer than 6 employees end up spending 20 times as much money and man-hours per employee complying with federal taxes as big companies do. That's a real deal breaker for a lot of folks with a good idea who want to get started. We should also be putting people to work rebuilding our infrastructure, our airports, our railways, our roads, our bridges, our ports, our tunnels, and our broadband system, which is woefully behind and more expensive than many other advanced economies. I support boosting public investment in infrastructure by creating a national infrastructure bank that will combine public and private funds for better paying jobs, and it will strengthen our economy, because when goods can be shipped faster or when we can communicate more quickly over broadband, people can actually get their work done more easily and efficiently. The same goes for investing in cleaner, renewable energy. We have to combat climate change. It is one of the most consequential crises facing us on our planet. And it's also a source of 21st century jobs that will save us money in the long run and help us deal with the challenges of climate. There's no doubt in my mind that if we got serious, as we should, on a national basis, we can create those millions of jobs and businesses by emphasizing clean, renewable energy. Iowa, where I spend time when I'm not in New Hampshire, already gets 1/3 of its electricity from wind. Their unemployment rate is below 5%. They are actually manufacturing parts of and assembling wind turbines. They're trying to set up a whole supply chain, as well as dealing with the challenge posed to actually turning clean, renewable energy into economic opportunities. We also must step up funding for scientific and medical research. One of the worst consequences of the so-called sequester was the cut across the board in research. The NIH budget stalled and falling. We laid off young scientists because that's the way the hierarchy works. Older scientists, they were in line first, they've been at it longer. We shut down labs. We ended potentially life-saving or certainly life-extending research. And that too can lead to innovative companies, even entire new industries. That's what the Human Genome Project did in the 90s. As I recall, we spent $3.5 billion or so of federal dollars mapping the human genome. And then, as we are so good at doing, we did it with the internet, we did it with the human genome, we took that knowledge, paid for with our tax dollars, and put it out into the public arena. Businesses started, jobs were created. It's estimated that something like $985 billion in new economic opportunities, growth, wealth was created. I think this can happen by not only investing in research, but in building on President Obama's initiatives on precision medicine and brain research. And while we're at it, let's keep building on what the Obama administration has done to get healthcare costs under control. The Affordable Care Act has done a lot in that area, but healthcare is still a key driver of long-term deficits. So we've got to keep working to get those costs under control. Unleashing entrepreneurship, closing corporate loopholes that shift jobs overseas, doubling down on infrastructure and basic research spending will give us the opportunity to also get our businesses to start investing more here at home. We really need that to get our economy going again. We need American businesses to look at their balance sheets and the opportunities here, weigh that, and expand right here in America. If it's time to open a new branch or launch a new product or hire some more people, that should happen right here. That's important to America's productivity and to our growth. Now, it doesn't get enough serious attention, but strong growth also means investing in what I call family economics, policies that make life easier, more bearable for working parents. Many of the students here today, you will face the kind of stresses in the workplace that we're starting to see long articles written about, as there was one a week or so ago in the New York Times. And why is that? Because the workday is now 24/7. You're never disconnected, are you? In many states, quality childcare costs more than college tuition. Think about that. How are you supposed to go to work every day, do your best, if you worry about whether your kids are in good hands? Or consider paid family leave. For many workers, staying home to take care of a sick child or an aging parent means losing a paycheck, or worse, even losing a job. That is an impossible choice we shouldn't ask anyone to make, and yet American workers are forced to make it every day. Policies like these are often seen as luxuries or kind of dismissed as family issues or even women's issues, as though that somehow makes them less important. But in fact, they are growth strategies. Later on, if you want, we can talk about how when I was Secretary of State, we not only promoted women's rights, but we really promoted women's economic participation. Every country in the world would see their GDP go up if women were full participants in the economy. And we need that here at home. We can't afford to leave any talent on the sidelines. The more easily people can work, the more they can promote their own businesses or go up in the business they're part of. It's pretty straightforward, and other countries have realized this. They're putting these kinds of policies into place, and they are actually outpacing us on women joining the workforce. You know what else is a strategy for strong growth? Comprehensive immigration reform. Now, Mr. Trump may not want to admit it, but it's actually true. If undocumented immigrants were able to join the formal economy, the United States would increase our GDP by an estimated $700 billion over 10 years. And we would stop unscrupulous employers from undercutting workers on wages. So the politics of immigration reform may seem complex, but the economics are pretty straightforward. A lot of prosperity is at stake. That's one of the reasons we need to get this done. So strong growth is the first pillar, but what about fair growth? Well, fair may mean different things to different people. Here's what it means to me. If you work full-time in America, you and your kids should not have to live in poverty. That's not fair, but that's what happens to millions of workers. That's why we have to raise the minimum wage. It's also not fair that women are still paid less than men and women of color paid least of all. That's not fair either. It's 2015. Women should be paid fairly for our work. And bosses who steal their workers' wages should be punished. If a company does well, we should also incentivize that the rewards don't just go to the shareholders and executives, but they should be shared through profit sharing with the workers that make that possible. I support that. If it works at market basket stores across New England, it can work across America. I also believe when we're talking about fairness, multimillionaires should pay higher tax rates than their secretaries. That's Warren Buffett's strong point. Right now, our tax code is tilted in favor of the wealthy. Republicans and their proposals want to make it even more imbalanced, with more help for the wealthy, decking the stack even more against everybody else. It is hardworking middle-class families who deserve tax relief. And if you're a successful company that has benefited from everything America has to offer, you shouldn't be able to game the system or be rewarded for shipping jobs overseas. And you should pay the taxes you owe without any tricks by high-priced lawyers and lobbyists. Fairness also means giving everyone an equal shot at making the most of their God-given potential. That is why I believe so strongly in early learning, so all kids, no matter who they are or where they're born, can get the best possible start in life. And it's also why, under my new college compact, no one will have to borrow a dime to pay tuition at a public college or university. And you'll be able to refinance your student debt no matter where you go to school, just like your mortgage or car loan. At a time when college has never been more important to a person's ability to compete and win in the global economy, anyone with the talent and the work ethic should be able to get a college education. It is simply wrong that something so important, so indispensable, should be so expensive. And fairness is why I support making smart investments in struggling communities, from inner cities to coal country to Indian country. I've called for a new and comprehensive commitment to equity and opportunity, especially for communities of color. Because in America, where you live, what you look like should not determine whether you succeed or not. I think talent is universal, but opportunity isn't. When everyone has a chance to study hard, work hard, and make their contribution, that's fair growth. That's what I've always believed. That's what I was raised to believe. That's what I will fight for as president. And finally, here's what I mean by long-term growth. This is especially important for future business leaders, like many of you here at Tuck. Too many pressures in our economy push us toward short-termism, what I call quarterly capitalism. That's what happens when too much attention is focused on the next earnings report or the short-term share price, and too little attention on the sources of long-term growth, like research and development, physical capital, and talent. In recent years, some of America's biggest companies have spent more than half their earnings to buy back their own stock, and another third or more to pay dividends. That doesn't leave a lot to raise pay or invest in workers or new plant and equipment. We're actually seeing net business investment, including things like factories, machines, research labs, decline as a share of the economy. There was a recent survey of CEOs of top American corporations, and they were asked the following question, paraphrasing it. If you knew you could make an investment today that would pay off in 10 years, investing in plant, equipment, research development, training your workforce, and it would be a significant payoff for the company going into the future, but it would knock 1 penny off your stock price, would you do it? And the answer was no. I couldn't believe the survey. I thought, that's kind of hard to understand. And I actually called someone I know who is the CEO of a major American corporation. I said, I just saw this survey. The answer was yes, I was asked. And you said you couldn't do it. Wish I could say that I could do it, was the response, but in the environment in which we're in, I couldn't do it. These trends must change. Workers are assets, investing in them pay off, training pays off, research does pay off in most cases. I've proposed a $1,500 tax credit for every worker that companies train and hire. I also have put forth a plan to reform capital gains taxes and to reward longer-term investments that give corporations a little more breathing room that will create more jobs rather than just quick trades. We also need to do a better job at managing risk, particularly on Wall Street. At its best, Wall Street helps Main Street grow and prosper. It boosts new companies that make America more competitive around the world. But as we know too well, in the years before the crash, financial firms piled risk upon risk, and regulators in Washington either couldn't or wouldn't keep up. Now we have new rules. The Dodd-Frank rules and other rules have been put into place, but there are still risks in our financial system that could well cause another crisis. Banks have paid billions of dollars in fines, but few executives have been held personally accountable. Too big to fail is still too big a problem. Regulators don't have the tools and support they need to protect our economy. To prevent irresponsible behavior on Wall Street from devastating Main Street again, we need more accountability, tougher rules, and stronger enforcement. I've also put forth a plan to build on the progress we've made under President Obama to be able to do that. And I will stand firm against any effort to roll back the protections we have already put in place or passed. So for me, there is a very clear set of imperatives that we have to pay attention to if we're going to have strong growth, fair growth, and long-term growth. But just last night, a conservative group announced that they're going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to go after the new Consumer Financial Protection Board. That's a board that exists only to protect Americans from unfair and deceptive business deals like the ones that brought so much pain to so many families during the crisis. Why would anyone have a problem with that? I believe in competition, but I also believe that you shouldn't have your team fielded where half the players or more are hobbled, or where there's a concerted effort to try to tilt the game against everybody so we never know who can go as far as his or her talent takes them. That's why I want to protect competition. I want to reward innovation. I want to see our economy prosper by having a great flowering of more entrepreneurs and small businesses. That's threatened when big businesses squeeze out smaller competitors, or when market concentration lets them get away with raising prices because they know their customers have nowhere else to go. I've called for a thorough review of mergers between 4 of America's 5 largest health insurers, including 2 of the largest here in New Hampshire. And I have spoken out against pharmaceutical companies jacking up prices on drugs that chronically sick people rely on, not because the drugs are suddenly more expensive or there is a need to pay off the research. Many of these drugs have been around for decades, but simply because they have no competition. So price gouging can occur. I truly believe many business leaders are eager to lead and to embrace their responsibilities to their workers, their communities, and indeed to our country. That's what shifting from a short-term to a long-term growth strategy is all about. And I hope that you at Tuck take that mission to heart, because I think it's important to figure out how we can remove the pressures, the short-term pressures on CEOs like the ones that I mentioned and the one I spoke to. You should be able to aspire to do more, to build a business that provides lasting value and promotes the kind of growth that will make us stronger, fairer, and richer. Now, some of you, I'm sure, will be starting businesses if you haven't already. Or you might manage workers or advise public officials, maybe even run for office yourself. So whether you believe in my version of strength and fairness and long-term thinking or not, I hope you will take a hard look at what we need to do to make sure the American economy works for everybody again. We are only strong leading the world, whether it's facing up to climate change or terrorism, if we are strong here at home. And much of that strength derives from our economic strength. You know, when you're a woman running for president, you hear the words glass ceiling a lot. And many people think that shattering that highest, hardest glass ceiling is a goal worth pursuing, and no surprise, I happen to agree with them. But I am running for president because I want every American to go as far as his or her talent and hard work can take them. I don't want any ceiling holding anyone down. And that's really what my economic agenda is all about, building a no-ceilings economy in which our middle class keeps growing, poverty keeps shrinking, opportunity is universal. No one gets left behind. That's what I'm working for. I hope you will join me in that mission. Let's do it together. Thank you all very much.
So thank you very much. You know, I'm teaching at Tuck, and at the beginning of every course, the students have a real interest in finding out how to address me, whether to call me professor, governor, Mr., coach. I used to coach my kids. So I thought it'd be appropriate and fine if we just addressed each other as Hillary and John.
I love that, John. Thank you.
Okay.
It's a lot easier.
That is, unless you'd like to be addressed by your alias from Saturday Night Live.
Yes, Val the bartender.
That was terrific, by the way. I watched it again this morning.
Well, you know, if this gig doesn't work out, I can fall back on that.
So we're in New Hampshire, and you're here all the time. You could be a resident for the amount of days you're here. I'd like to first ask you, what do you consider so special about the state of New Hampshire?
Well, my memories about New Hampshire really go back a long way, because when I was at Wellesley, I and a group of my friends came up here and worked in the presidential election of, hold your breath now, 1968. And so I started coming to New Hampshire a long time ago, but my most recent flock of memories goes back to my husband's campaign in '92, and how much at home we felt. I remember in that campaign, they were much shorter in those days. He announced in October, and by the end of October, around my birthday, I was in Keene, New Hampshire, which was at that time very famous for their pumpkin Halloween festival. And I just had the best time, talking to people and going around the town. And it's been like that for me ever since. I have such a personal, I feel such a personal connection with this state and the many, many friends we've made over the years. And really the beauty, I'd skied when I was in college and law school, had friends who had places up here to ski. So I've done a lot of different things, and I like being in the state, going around the state, and talking and listening to people.
Is there a special person who comes to mind from all the people you've met who you think really reflects what's so special about our great state?
Well, as Susan knows, there's a woman named Mary Louise Hancock. And Mary Louise Hancock is nearly 100 years old, right, Susan? And she has observed every single presidential election going back to the Roosevelts, I believe. And she was very active when she was younger. She obviously doesn't get around so much or so well anymore, but she is a passionate TV watcher. So she watches everything going on in every campaign, and I met her as I was campaigning for Bill back in 92. So when I started this campaign, I went to see her. I just adore being around her and listening to her. She has lots of good advice. And she started to critique me. And she is really tough. Like, you shouldn't do this, and maybe you should do more of that, and I'm not so sure that this is a good strategy. And she's like a walking encyclopedia of the presidential campaigns in New Hampshire. And I don't know if anybody's ever done an oral history with her or not, but they should, because she knows everybody. And she will also, if she knows you well enough, tell you her unvarnished opinions of us all, which is a little scary.
She sure has done that with me. And what else is amazing about Mary Louise is, she got polio at an early age. She's had numerous afflictions, and never once have I ever heard her complain about anything. Most of us complain about everything, and I've never heard her complain.
Well, John, that's so true, because when I first saw her this time around, she doesn't complain. She just she's a New Hampshire granite stater. I mean, she is tough and resilient, and kind of gets through whatever affliction or problem she has. But she spent quite a bit of time, telling me exactly what I needed to do to take care of myself. And she quizzes me. I get messages from her. I get little handwritten notes. Are you getting enough sleep? Do this, do that. So she's just a remarkable person in every way, but also a very astute observer of human nature and politics.
And how about your travels as Secretary of State? Julia mentioned that you have been to 112 countries. Is there one moment that stands out in your mind, or a couple, from all of your travels?
Well, there are many. I never traveled much before my husband became president, and then as First Lady, I traveled. As Secretary of State, many of the trips I made were to the same places, going to Europe for meetings, going to the Middle East for meetings, going to China and Japan and South Korea, going south to Latin America, formal meetings, big gatherings, and the like. But there were places that I chose to go to in addition to the ones that I either had to go to as part of my responsibilities or that I thought it was be good to show up. One of the places that I chose to go to was Goma in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is in the eastern part of Congo, where there had been a conflict raging for 20 years. 5.5 million people are reputed to have been killed, and where some of the worst incidents of rape as a tool of war were reported. And I wanted to go there because I thought it was important for the United States to demonstrate its commitment to helping to try to resolve the Great Lakes area conflict, and particularly in Congo. It was also important that we try to work with other countries to get better peacekeeping. There was a UN mission, but it wasn't always performing as it in many of us thought it should. So anyway, I went. I was in Kinshasa and then flew to Goma. And here's a place that if you read about it, you think has to be one of the most distressed, depressing places you can imagine. And there were certainly instances where that came across, but my overwhelming impression was of joy. People in the streets going about their business, people being very happy to see somebody like the Secretary of State from the United States there. I went to a refugee camp, which had a lot of problems in the way it was set up and the way it was run, but the people themselves were incredibly dignified, and they took me around talking about how they had an elected leadership and very much avant-garde. They had an elected male leader and an elected woman leader, and what was happening in the camp, what they needed. And then I went to one of the places that takes in women who have been raped, regardless of age, because we're talking about, babies to very old, elderly women. And oftentimes they are left to die. And the women I met with at that place of healing were so brave because they often themselves were victims of these horrific assaults. And then they would go back into the forest periodically to find other women who might have been just left there. And I sat and talked with them, and their stories of what happened to them were just beyond one's comprehension. But then I went out into the parking lot, and they were dancing and singing and selling products they had made out of cloth that they had procured or dyed themselves. And the extraordinary juxtaposition of this terrible conflict that killed so many, that assaulted, raped, just inflicted the worst kind of human cruelty, and the way people were trying to get on with their lives, support each other, rebuild bonds of love and family was just so incredibly impressive and heartwarming to me. So there are a lot of places that I went that I felt like I learned something and had new experiences, but that in particular sticks in my mind.
That must have been very moving.
I knew some of the people because during even the time I was senator and the conflict kept raging from the 90s onward, we did try to support some of the charities and some of the other non-governmental organizations that were helping in that area. It's important to go to places like that. I saw some things in the refugee camp, which we were supporting along with other governments and other NGOs that I really didn't like and wanted to change, and I could have never seen that unless I had been there. And then when I met with a lot of the survivors and their advocates at the facility I visited, I came away with some very specific ideas about what more we could do to help them, rather than just having our ideas back in Washington, really listening to them about what would make a difference. So it was a really important visit because we did, to some extent, we were able to sort of move our aid into an area that was more responsive to the needs that they told me about.
So this is a forum on America's economic future, and you mentioned a lot of great policies and proposals. When I was governor, I traveled around New Hampshire, and what I heard from most people is they liked the way we work together to get things done. How do we possibly get that same attitude in Washington? Because it has to happen in order to pass the proposals that you've suggested this afternoon.
Well, I spent a lot of time thinking about that because we're living in this election in a very contentious environment. I don't know all the reasons. I can't pretend. I'll leave that to the political scientists, the psychologists, the anthropologists who are here at Dartmouth. But the result I see, where you have a very strong sense on the part of a number of voters that nothing works, throw the bums out, no matter who they are, no matter what they did, just give us somebody new, and even better if they've never had any public responsibilities at all. And then you've got another group that basically says, no, I want the guy who's trying to blow everything up, and I want the guy who's really mad because he's channeling my anger because things are not working the way that they should. And it's important to realize, just think about this, because as just one example, all the Republican candidates, when you ask them about climate change, they basically say, I'm not a scientist, or they go further and say it's a hoax, it doesn't exist, we shouldn't even talk about it, let alone deal with it. Yet in the 2008 Republican platform, climate change is mentioned, clean and renewable energy is mentioned. So look at what's happened in basically 7 short years. I have to assume that a lot of what's boiling beneath the surface is a result of the Great Recession. You know, the people who were hurt or knew somebody who was hurt, and the anger that people feel because government didn't protect them, you know, big banks and other bad actors, you know, really took advantage and crashed the economy. So I think that you got to come to grips with what's happening below the surface that is fueling a lot of what you hear from the candidates on the Republican side, but also candidates on all sides. So what are we going to do about that? Well, I do think that we've got to get back to doing everything possible to find common ground. And when I was First Lady, I did that. When I was Senator, I did that. I certainly did it as Secretary of State. I worked with people who had very different political philosophies, but we found common ground to try to move a piece of legislation forward or cooperate on some kind of other initiative. And we've got to do that. I think it's also important to stand your ground because there are a lot of really bad ideas that people cling to, and you can't let that drive the debate. So part of what I'm trying to do in this campaign, John, is to put forth ideas. I don't mind having a debate about any ideas. I just ask that they be at least somewhat fact-based. I know that's a radical request, but we have moved our politics so far from an evidence-based decision-making approach. You can't do that in any other part of life. I mean, you can't, in a business, sit around saying, I'm not going to do any market research, I'm not going to talk to anybody, I believe that, this will work no matter what. Well, you can't get away with that in any other human endeavor, and we shouldn't let it happen in politics. So part of what I'm trying to do is to lay out an agenda. I will have a discussion with anybody about the particulars, but I do ask that people bring a level of commitment to actually looking at the facts. You can interpret them differently, but we've got to get back to where we operate on some common understanding of what's happening in the world and beyond. I just want to end with this one point. It really matters what somebody running for president, and it really matters a lot what somebody who is president says. Words can tumble markets. Words can literally start conflicts. Words can move people into the adversary column instead of the friend or partner column. So words really matter. And then what you want to do in public life really matters. I was in Hong Kong on a pre-existing trip in July of 2011. And it was when there were a lot of threats by the Republicans to shut the government down. And I was at an investment conference to try to encourage Asian investors to look at the United States. And the news was filled with, the government's going to be shut down, America's going to default on its debt. And these business leaders from across Asia were just incredulous. I mean, they literally stood in a line to say, what does this mean? Can this really happen? And, I was there as the chief cheerleader for our country, and so I said, of course not, that can never happen, don't worry about it. And it didn't happen that time, but fast forward, it did happen in the fall of 2013. The government was shut down. Now, I followed the press because I was really interested in seeing what the attitude in Asia and elsewhere would be. And it was contempt. It was, they can't even govern themselves. They want to set the rules for the global economy, and they can't even govern themselves. And in fact, one Chinese finance ministry official said, it's time to de-Americanize the world. That is a serious problem for our economy and for our democracy. We can have big differences, and we've had big differences from the beginning. If any of you have seen Hamilton, and I hope you do, or at least get the CD, we've had big differences way back when. But now those differences are heard around the world in a nanosecond. So while we're trying to sort out our differences, people are making bets for or against America. And we cannot lead and have the kind of future that I want for all of you or for my granddaughter if we don't take seriously how we deal with these problems, and working together has got to be the most fundamental rebooting of our political system after this election.
And the president, as a governor, has a big responsibility in getting people to work together. There's so many other topics I'd like to cover, but I think at this point we'll open it up to questions from the audience. What I would ask, if you ask a question, to please stand, give your affiliation to Dartmouth, very, very briefly, and also where you're from. Raise your hand if you have a question. And I'd like the first question to come from a student, because this, after all, is supposed to be an educational experience, primarily from our great students here at Dartmouth and Tuck. So raise your hands and somebody will come by and give you a mic.
Right over there. Stand up.
Hi, my name is Alex Petros. I'm a freshman at undergraduate at Dartmouth. You've talked a lot on the campaign trail about not wanting to repeat the foreign policy mistakes in the Iraq War that we have since learned about, and the costs of American intervention overseas, which you dealt with as Secretary of State. However, given increasing Chinese aggression in the South China Sea, the deteriorating situation in Syria and Iraq, how do you plan to balance the short-term necessity of international stability with the long-term costs of American resentment and intervention overseas?
A very good and important question. Look, I think as president, you have to be focused on the immediate, the problems that are brewing, and then the longer-term ones on the horizon, and you have to do that all at the same time. And we do have a combination of those. We have tremendous opportunities in the world if we decide we're going to lead, and that starts with how we're going to make sure our own country is strong. But we also have to be aware that it's going to take a lot of diplomatic balancing. I believe in smart power, which basically is we take all the tools of our toolkit, defense, diplomacy, development, and we use them in a way to promote our values, further our interests, and advance our security in concert with like-minded nations, friends, partners, and allies. So you mentioned two specific issues. The long-term relationship with China is one of the most important that we have to understand and work on, and it is a constant balancing act. When I was Secretary of State, we worked hard to try to find areas of cooperation between the United States and China, to build some bonds of trust and understanding. A lot of the leadership that was passing from the scene while I was there had never been able to travel when they were young. Their education was interrupted by the Cultural Revolution. They didn't have as broad a worldview, but they were focused on the economic development of China and did a remarkable job lifting hundreds of millions of people out of absolute poverty and are still committed to that. While they have been building their economy in the last 35 plus years, they have also been focused on internal growth and trying to figure out how to manage population and geographic considerations, et cetera. Now they are with this new leadership, and Xi Jinping, as you may know, actually spent time in the United States as a young man. Now they are trying to figure out how do we keep the growth going, because we have to keep producing economic growth at as high a percentage as possible. How do we assert ourselves on the international scene? And how do we do as much as we can to control our environment in the Pacific? And that's why you see what's happening in the South China Sea. There is a determined policy by the Chinese leadership to have a presence across Asia. They are building ports, both on their own or in conjunction with other countries. They are building artificial land masses near or on atolls and reefs, claiming territory that others are also claiming. And I think it's in large measure because they want to assert themselves, and that requires a physical presence, and it requires building their navy. So they are building what's called a blue water navy, and we have to be very clear that the Pacific and the South China Sea don't belong to China. And that's why you probably saw a few weeks ago, U.S. Navy vessels went through the South China Sea to keep navigation and commerce open. I had many conversations about this with the Chinese leaders I dealt with. And they have a very different attitude. They really trace their claims in this area to ancient China. They had explorers, they had traders, and they claim that, therefore they have a right to a lot of this territory. They've gotten into some disputes with Vietnam and the Philippines and others. It's really important that the United States remain a Pacific power and a presence, because we have treaties with a number of countries where we are mutually committed to the defense of each, although clearly it's our burden. We would have to defend Japan and South Korea and Australia, Philippines, you name it. We have got obligations, so we have to be present. But it's really important that we don't become aggressive. We just have to become very clear that we're going to keep the sea lanes open, and we're going to protect the territorial claims of those with whom we have treaties. This is a long-term responsibility. Syria is different. Syria has metastasized into a civil war that has created openings for a variety of bad actors and terrorist groups, and really incited a conflict and a regional proxy competition. And the United States is not and should not be trying to determine how this turns out militarily. I agree with the president's decision. We have air power, we have some special operators, we're trying to retrain the Iraqi army that we left in good shape and Prime Minister Maliki basically destroyed. So there are certain discrete functions we can perform, but we will not, certainly as far as I'm concerned, try to go in on our own to defeat ISIS. Having said that, I consider ISIS a growing global threat, not just a regional threat. Why? Because they are very sophisticated. They are what you might say the first internet-savvy terrorist network. Danny Benjamin, who I know is here at Dartmouth, who worked with me in the State Department, has a lot of understanding of this problem. And they have they've mastered the ability to fund themselves, stealing oil, selling it on the black market, stealing antiquities, getting those into the marketplace. So they have a capacity to sustain themselves while they are continuing to be aggressive on seizing and holding territory, creating affiliates like the one that claimed responsibility for bringing down the Russian airliner in Sinai. So we have to keep our eye on it, but we have to do what we can diplomatically to get more players to work with us to try to squeeze them. And the last thing I would say is Defense Secretary Carter said the other day that our policy now toward ISIS is the 3 R's: Raqqa, Ramadi, and raids. Raqqa, where they have a headquarters in Syria; Ramadi, the major Iraqi city that they took over; and raids, not just our special forces, but others. We recently had the loss of the first American soldier in a raid that was done in conjunction with the Kurdish Peshmerga special forces. So there's a lot we can do to support surveillance, reconnaissance, intelligence, training, but this has to be done by others, not by us.
Thank you very much. Let's have another question from a student on this side of the auditorium. The volunteers just identify a student and give that student a mic.
Hi, my name is Chris Foley. I'm a second-year Tuck student. In our global economics course, we talk a lot about the benefits of trade. And I was wondering if you could speak about how you think about trade and how that relates to your stance on the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Yes. Look, we have to trade. We are only 5% of the world's population. We have to sell things, goods and services, to 95% of the world. So we have to trade. The problem is that a lot of what has disadvantaged American businesses and workers over the last 10, 20 years has been currency manipulation, which is not part of the trade agenda. I, along with others, had hoped we could move toward an agreement that would include currency manipulation within the body of the agreement with some kind of enforceable provisions. We have seen the de-skilling of the American workforce at a time when we should be doubling down on investing in the reskilling. And I mention that because I think trade is often a disadvantage when you don't have investments in your own country to make sure you can be competitive, some of what I talked about earlier. The Republicans are always for trade, but I am for trade plus investing in our own workforce, plus adopting a longer-term view, plus trying to figure out how we have economic growth that raises incomes at all levels. And in the absence of that kind of approach that combines trade with what we need to do here at home, I worry that we're not going to get the benefits that classical trade theory says we will. And so I said years ago when I was Secretary of State that this is the gold standard, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I hoped it would become the gold standard. I wanted it to be. And I think the way I view them, any trade agreement, is does it create more good jobs for Americans? Does it raise Americans' wages? And does it advance our national security? And at the end of this very tough, long negotiation, I don't think it did as much as I would have wanted to see. So I did come out against it. That doesn't mean I'm against trade. I'm not one of the no trade at any cost people. When I was a senator, I voted for some trade agreements and I voted against some trade agreements. I tried to evaluate each one. And here, I just don't think we've made the investments so that we can take advantage of the opportunities that an agreement like the TPP might very well offer. At this, after having added it all up and looked at all the different aspects of it that I could, I came out against it. But I'm not against trade. But I am against us, just kind of going in a short-term way into the global marketplace and expecting that's going to work for American businesses and workers, because I don't think it has. I think we're beyond comparative advantage theoretically right now. We're into a different kind of global market. And I want us to get our own act together, and then I think we can outcompete anybody. But going into big trade agreements where, we could be very well further disadvantaged, except for, some select businesses and the opportunities they might get, I think would be not the right thing to do at this time.
Thank you. Let's take a question from somebody in the middle section.
My name is Carol, and I live in Hanover, and I've taught in Hanover's adult education group. And I have a question that I hope you won't find either too threatening or too ridiculous. What do you think of Donald Trump and his desire? He's leading in the Republican polls now, so people are taking him seriously. What do you think of Donald Trump?
Well, I always got along with him when he was my constituent and before he started running for president. And I have been quite surprised by some of what he has said as a presidential candidate. And I have criticized him for some of what he has said. His comments, his derogatory comments about immigrants, about women, I just think have no place in a presidential campaign. And I don't think that they should be allowed to stand without responding. So I am, like everyone else, seeing how this campaign of his develops. And I don't know what the Republican voters are going to do. That's their business, not mine. But I hope to be the nominee. I will run against anybody they nominate. And if it's him, put on your seatbelts. That's all I can tell you.
Okay, so we have time for one more question. So raise your hands, and the monitors, if you would select somebody for a question.
Hi, my name is Sapphire. I'm a sophomore here. I was wondering what specifically your plans are for ensuring economic equality between men and women, and if you think that complete social and political equality will just naturally follow after this, or what your opinion of that is?
Well, Sapphire, I love that name. I have to start by saying I've seen a lot of progress in my own life in terms of treating women with more respect and providing greater equality of opportunity. We're at a campus that changed. I went to Yale, it changed. There's lots of things that have certainly been more open to women's rights and women's participation. But I think we still have a long way to go. And start with the really simple challenge of equal pay for equal work. Recently here in New Hampshire, I met a young man who came up to me and said, "I want to tell you why I'm for you." And I said, "Please." And he said, "I'll tell you why." He said, and he was probably mid to late 20s. He said, "My first real job," as he called it, was working as a cashier in a store where his mother worked. And he was really proud of it because he got to go to work and, not doing odd jobs, and he had hours and all of that. So he did the same job as his mother, who'd been there for 4 years. And then he got his first paycheck. And he went home, and he was really proud. He showed it to his mother, and he saw his mother's face just fall. And he asked her what was the matter. And she said, "They are paying you $1 more an hour than they're paying me." And she'd been there 4 years. I heard the story, and I said to this young man, I said, "So what explained that?" And he said, "Well, I tried to find out." And basically the manager thought he was being really nice to me. He said, "Well, we like to keep our eyes on young men like you because we'd love for you to make a career here and, become a manager someday." And so he said to me, "But they never offered that to my mother." Now, the same job and not getting equal pay is the most obvious example. There are other variants on that I run into all the time. One of the most common questions I am asked as I travel around the country is about equal pay. And I'm in town halls or I'm in other settings, and people ask me this. In fact, I had a little girl in Las Vegas who I called on. She stood up and she said, "If you're the girl president, will you make the same as the boy president?" And I said, "Well, I think so. I'm going to look into that." And so what causes that? Well, there are old caricatures and stereotypes that still, unfortunately, afflict us in our society about what women should make or whether women need to make as much as men. The Lilly Ledbetter case, which was the famous non-equal pay case that a woman in Alabama, Lilly Ledbetter, worked in a factory. She rose through the ranks. She became a foreman, and she was one of 4 or 5. They were all doing the same job. They were all in charge of a workforce on an assembly line. And years later, she found out she never made the same as even younger men who were promoted after her. And she sued. She tried to find out why, and basically it was, well, we just think that, men can go further and men have more responsibilities. So a lot of old stereotypes. But then there's the problem of lack of transparency. it's legal in most instances for companies to say they don't want you discussing what your pay is with any of your fellow workers, and you can even be retaliated against if you talk about it or you show, your pay stub to somebody else. So we've got to get to more transparency and more fairness, because this is a problem. This literally keeps dollars out of the pockets of working women, many of whom are contributing to their family, some of whom are single moms, and they are their sole family support. So there's a lot of work to do on that. The second thing I would say, to go to your larger question about political and social and economic equality, that's really the ongoing struggle. And certainly in our country, we've come much further than many, many places. After Prime Minister Abe became Prime Minister, he contacted me and wanted to talk about how he could get the Japanese economy going. And he'd read the IMF reports and the World Bank reports talking about every country was literally leaving money on the table because women were not participating in the workforce. And Abe said, I got to figure out what to do about that. So people are waking up to it. It's not just a nice woman's issue and good thing to do. It really is part of the growth strategy. But I think that we've got work to do in making sure that we kind of quit thinking in old, outdated ways about women and girls, that we also do more to empower women themselves to see their own potential. STEM is the perfect example. Back in 1980, there was a much higher percentage of graduates out of STEM courses in colleges, particularly in computer courses, than there are now, because the work atmosphere has really pushed back a lot of women, making them feel that they aren't welcome, that even if they were to study and do well, they wouldn't have a place. So there are just a lot of ways we've got to sort of open our minds and open doors so that we have the full participation of everybody. We need every young man and every young woman to make his or her contribution to America. And I was asked the other day, I was at a big event in Palo Alto, and the last question was a young woman like you who said, well, so what are you going to do to try to move us toward gender equality? And I said, well, I'm going to try to get elected president. I think that would be a really good start to make that clear and unequivocal statement about it. So,
well, Hillary, thank you very much for coming to Dartmouth and to Tuck. I'm sure the students would welcome you back to a future winter carnival if you would be so inclined to attend. So let's give Hillary a real round of applause for coming to Dartmouth.